Well, I did promise you, ladies and gentlemen, that our panel was going to be truly international, so I'm going to call up our panelists now, two of whom you've already heard from, three of whom I'm going to introduce you to. So, Jens Frölich-Holte, would you join us, Jens, and Manuel Barange, whom we've heard from, but also let me welcome to the stage Sam Tam. Now, he's very familiar to many of you at Arctic Frontiers, not least because of his wonderful moccasins. He is Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also Ministry of Social and Family Development. And goodness, you have so many handles, it's untrue. But all, of course, means that he's a minister in the government of Singapore, and we're delighted that Singapore takes such an interest in the Arctic, so welcome, Sam. Also, let me invite up Evan Bloom, who's Director of the Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs in the Department of State in the United States. Evan, welcome to you. And Vladimir Ryabinin, who is the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, goodness, that's a mouthful, of UNESCO. He also is an Assistant Director General of UNESCO. So what a panel, what an international collective set of experience and insight we've got. Ladies and gentlemen, give them a warm hand. So, I'm going to turn first to our three newbies, and then we'll get more insight from you two. But to get all three of you going on this, the message that we're hearing isn't altogether bleak. I mean, it's hugely challenging because the oceans are in trouble and the Arctic is not immune to that. But we've also heard some quite encouraging things about the way in which clever long-term management of the oceans, for example, in terms of the Arctic fishery, can pay huge dividends. It can introduce us to the notion of long-term sustainability. So, Evan, I'll start with you. The US is hugely important in all of these discussions. Right now, what is the US government's sort of take on the possibility of developing further in terms of economic development in the Arctic, but maintaining that key sort of long-term sustainability?
So, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. From our point of view, sustainability is absolutely vital. The Arctic states and Arctic communities have depended for their livelihoods on the ocean for millennia, and it's vital that everything in terms of ocean policy be handled sustainably, to take a precautionary approach and to move in tandem with science. And I was very glad that a representative from the FAO brought up the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which is an excellent example of international cooperation in the Arctic that focuses on the need to develop science and to act in a precautionary manner as we go forward. But there are other examples as well, and I agree with the point he made, for example, that it's very important to support fisheries management, because we don't see that as by any means a broken process. Of course, it can be improved in many ways, but there are so many regional fisheries management organizations and international processes that are focused on ensuring the sustainability of food supply and of fisheries, and we'd focus on those issues.
Yeah, well, fish is important, and we'll come back to fish, but isn't there a sort of elephant in the room here? That is that your government, and indeed the Norwegian government, while they talk the talk about long-term sustainable ocean management, they are doing some things in the oceans which seem to run entirely counter to a globally sustainable agenda. I'm thinking particularly of the determination to continue fossil fuel exploration and extraction offshore. Your government appears committed to continuing that approach, and that seems to me deeply problematic, not only because if you take it into the Arctic region, it raises huge long-term security issues for the environment, but second of all, it's extracting more and more fossil fuel, which ultimately will be burned and which ultimately adds to the massive CO2 climate change problem the Earth already has.
So I think, at least for our government, it's important to have a mix of fuel options going forward into the future. I don't see a lot of countries closing their EEZs to these sort of developments, but we agree that it has to be managed efficiently and sustainably.
But if we're all buying into the notion that we're now into the stage of climate emergency, then that sort of, well, business as usual sort of approach isn't good enough, is it?
Well, you say if we're all buying into that notion, I think that we're mindful of...
We're not, aren't we?
Well, in terms of how we go forward in terms of energy development, I think that there's room for allowing deep-sea activities that promote energy security.
Thoughts on that from our other two new panelists, please. We'll start with you, Mr. Ryabinin.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Actually, before the session started, Evan told me that all difficult questions he will pass to me, and this is exactly what happened. Actually.
So he's a fortune teller, apart from anything else. Yeah.
So, but in principle, of course, there is a paradigm, and we know that there are some studies that show the economics of climate change, that the solutions do exist. And this requires, of course, a much wider approach than just the ocean-based approach. But we can refer, for example, to the book of Stiglitz about inequalities. So there are solutions indeed, and the science now, I think, may give answers to so many questions, including economics. And now this is what is, I think we call it the social contract for science. First of all, it was coined the climate science after the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen 2009, when all the science was there, but no one agreed to anything. So climate scientists started to think about this, and they understood it's impossible just to inform the governments. Have to do something more to convince the governments, convince the decision makers, convince the private sector. I think it's happening. Private sector is changing. The paradigm is changing, in my view, and now the turn is for the ocean also to do something like this in this direction.
But I just wonder, I'm just looking for sort of fairly simple and basic thoughts here. Is it your view that a lot of the fossil fuel, the oil and gas that sits under the seabed, much of it actually in different regions of the Arctic, much of it should be left there, despite the plans that the private sector has and governments, including the Russian government and Norwegian government, have to continue exploration and extraction, that ultimately that will have to change, and that much of that fossil fuel, that carbon, will have to remain, should remain, unexploited?
My view is that, we have to extract as less oil as we can. That is because I think there are solutions that that exist and as alternatives, and the issue is that we have to ensure our long-term longevity, but at the same time we also have to kind of overcome certain short-term issues.
So there is a transition.
There must be the transition, but what is important? That there is this notion of how much gigatons of carbon we can exploit and inject in the atmosphere. So then the climate change becomes dangerous.
Indeed. Well, I think we are very well aware of that now. If I may, I'm
just to conclude on this, the ocean capacity to absorb carbon is diminishing. So those estimates may be just on the
That's a very important point. Yeah, thank you for that, Vladimir. Sam, some will, particularly newbies to Arctic Frontiers, will be surprised to see a Singaporean minister here. But of course, you're a seafaring, trading city-state. The oceans are hugely important to you.
700 years.
Absolutely. But also you have a major concern that if the more alarming, the more extreme predictions of what might happen to sea levels, if the worst sort of forecasts for the future of rising temperatures around the world come true, yes. Singapore's in deep trouble.
We will be.
Yes. So when you come to an event like this, and of course it's not your first time, what's the message you're bringing?
Well, I think the most important message that I want to bring to the audience here is that when you are in the Arctic, you always hear this saying that what happened in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And the converse is also true, that whatever happened outside the Arctic doesn't stay outside the Arctic. So in Singapore, what happened to us is that we are a very small island state. Actually, we are surrounded by seas and oceans. On the eastern side, this is South China Sea. On the western side, is the Indian Ocean. We have a very small, a land area of 720 square kilometers. So I'm very envied that Norway has 0.30 million, square kilometers. Similarly, for Japan, we only have 720 square kilometers. And 1/3 of this, island is actually very low-lying. And we have 5.7 million people living on this tiny island where we literally built our city to the brink of the land, and our people live next to the water. And we are very, very careful about the water management, because if we are not careful, we pollute the water, the sea, and the oceans. Then the consequences will be disaster for us. Like, for example, if because of climate change, Arctic is melting and then sea level is rising, then Singapore will be in trouble. And we always heard that the sea level or global sea levels will rise by 1 meter within this century. And then if that happens, I think in the future prime ministers of Singapore government will have to conduct his cabinet meetings in a scuba diver's suit, because we will be submerged under the water. So for that matter, for survival, we actually have embarked on a very ambitious programs to deal with the rising sea level, where we want to raise the peripheral, the low areas of Singapore by 1 meter before the end of this century. And we have already set aside $100 billion on all kinds of infrastructure projects to make sure that come 2100, where the sea level rises by 1 meter, we will raise Singapore by 1.2 meter, and we have 0.2 meter to keep our feet dry. So indeed, we are doing a lot to make sure that we don't contaminate the ocean. We will do a lot to, we have been doing a lot to actually control or reduce the carbon emission. And we are going to have an election either this year or first quarter next year. And recently we introduced a carbon tax, to tax all the economies with no exemptions, cover all industries, just to make sure that come 2030, we want to reduce our carbon emission by 36% from the 2005 level. So this is really a very painful process. But I think that compare this pain with the pain of Singapore being overrun by seawater, this is a price that we think we should pay.
Indeed, it's fascinating to hear the realities of what sea level rise means for a city-state, an island state like your own, and it does perhaps reinforce the thought that here in the Arctic, the 8 Arctic nation states are in a sense, it sounds a bit weird, but they are the guardians of the ice to a certain extent, and obviously you're powerless to change the rise in temperatures. You can do your bit as part of the global community to respond to what is happening, but the North matters because the world is so interconnected, and I just wonder whether Norway, Jens, is trying to project an image with this sort of high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy, trying to send a message that, in a sense, you can have your cake and eat it. You can continue major economic developments in the Arctic Ocean and stay true to a sustainability agenda. And maybe what we're all realizing as human beings is that actually the idea that you can have cake and eat it too isn't usually right. In fact, it's very often utterly wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the reasons we have set up this panel is to highlight the let's say, link between protection and production. But if you want to have productive oceans, you need healthy oceans. And we have been fairly successful in managing that in Norway because we have scientifically based management plans. We have a very, very big cluster of ocean scientists. We have fairly good knowledge of our fish stocks, for instance, and can set the quotas based on scientific advice. And that's a model that has worked very well for Norway. And just to get to the point about fossil fuels, which has been raised. I mean, of course, we have very stringent environmental requirements for oil and gas activities. We have a very big carbon tax, and I applaud Singapore also for introducing a carbon tax. That's what we need. I mean, Norway as a country, we are doing our utmost to torpedo the demand for fossil fuels. We have signed up to the Paris Agreement. We support the development of climate technologies. We subsidize electric cars. So, I mean, in all our activities, we are reducing the demand for
Sure, but I mean, at its crudest, you're still a drug dealer who's providing the drug.
Yeah, but I think it's a fairly wrong comparison to make because oil and gas, it's not a drug, it's energy, and it's useful energy for a lot of people.
Sure, but there is the metaphor isn't entirely unfair because there is an addiction issue here. The world has been addicted for a very long time to fossil fuels.
But there are very useful supplements or substitutions in renewable energy, and you need fossil fuels to complement renewable energy sources for the time being. And if you have a stringent climate policy, and I mean more countries implementing climate policies will have a big impact on the demand for fossil fuels, like Singapore, for instance, and there's plenty of other countries in this world that needs to step up the game on climate regulations. I mean, if you look at Norway's industrial traditions, we haven't grown our economy by stopping things or refusing things. We have taken what we have and improved it and transitioned into something better. If you look at our sailing ships back in the 1800s, we had a lot of sailing vessels and a big merchant navy. We didn't transition quickly to the new generation of coal-powered boats because we banned sailing boats. It happened because a new technology and something better became available.
Yeah,
it was coal ships, not that good, but now we are transitioning into a greener way of shipping, for instance. So I think the technological transition that we are promoting is really going to make a change.
Right. Well, you made the case well, but whether people buy it is up to them, and we're going to get to questions in just a moment. But before we get to questions, I do want to introduce one more speaker because I am very mindful that it's how many? Well, we six blokes, men of a certain age up here on this panel, and that perhaps isn't ideal, but there we are. That's what this panel is. But I think yesterday in the morning, when we spoke to heard from a couple of our emerging young leaders, it became clear that the voice of youth is extremely important to all of these discussions, which is by way of introducing a voice now from one of the representatives at the Arctic Frontiers Student Forum. Sofia Farina is with us. So Sofia, I'd like, as we continue our discussion about the Arctic Ocean and long-term sustainability, I'd like your thoughts. And Sofia, ladies and gentlemen, is a master's student at the University of Bologna.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, fellow students, good morning. My name is Sofia Farina. I am a master's student in Earth System Physics at the University of Bologna, where I study the dynamics and modeling of the ocean and atmosphere. I have the pleasure and the honor to be here today thanks to the Arctic Frontiers Student Forum program, which this year hosts 30 bachelor and master students with 13 different nationalities, united by a strong interest in the Arctic. The Student Forum is an amazing example of cooperation. It brings together young people to analyze the same problem from their personal and specific point of view, sharing the knowledge and the tools acquired in their own fields of studies. In this analysis, our nationalities and the interests of our countries don't matter anymore. The priority is the interest of the world as a whole. This is the kind of cooperation that the Arctic needs. The IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere, at the basis of this debate, can also be seen as a good example of international cooperation. It is the result of a huge international effort bringing together the work of more than 100 scientists from more than 30 countries. Despite the cooperation that has characterized the Arctic in the last decades, events unfolding still point to the fact that there is more we can achieve together. I would like to underline, we are not talking only about climate change. The social, political, economical, biological consequences of the rise of global temperature, especially in the Arctic, are dramatic. But we should not forget that they sum up with a long list of other effects of the human activities all over the world. We found plastic and black carbon particles in the ice pack, microplastic in the organisms living in the Arctic Ocean, atmospheric pollutants in the air above it. We are dealing with changing Arctic animal life cycles and habits. The protection of the Arctic Ocean is currently an enormous, urgent, and most importantly, global problem. I am standing here as a representative of my generation, of women and men of science, and of all the youths working hard to build their knowledge to contribute to solve this problem. We are asking the concrete and unselfish cooperation between the policymakers of the world, a cooperation where the primary interest is that of the well-being of the planet and of the people, not that of the markets and economies. A cooperation where all the voices of the indigenous people, the scientists and the youngsters are taken in consideration. Yes, maybe some of you may perceive my opinion as idealistic, yet science is the less idealistic thing we can think about. And its unheard voice is saying that we have to decide on our priorities. Are we going to proactively manage and defend the Arctic, or are we going to allow this unbridled exploitation to satisfy the growing needs of markets and industries? I am asking you, do you hear the call for protection? Will you use the incredible power of this knowledge production in your decision processes? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you very much. Sophia just asked something that I want to hear your responses to. And Manuel, why don't you pick it up? She said, are you listening to those voices, particularly of young people, who use the word protection? You know, it's not a word, we've heard plenty of discussion of management and sustainability and expanded production, but done in the right kinds of ways. But we haven't used the word protection. Do you think the word protection is relevant to the future of the Arctic?
Good. Oil is over then?
Oil is, well, no, oil isn't over.
Never over.
I want our audience to come back to it. But
Over for me, though.
But I want you to say whether this idea of protecting the Arctic is an important one. And of course, that does play into what Norway thinks is acceptable in terms of continued exploration and exploitation.
Absolutely. I think protection is absolutely essential. The Secretary mentioned in his intervention that the goal should be 100% management of seascapes, the oceans, and I fully subscribe to that. And that management incorporates all options of protection, conservation, and sustainable utilization that we may want to think of. There are places that need to be protected because they are in danger, and the only way of ensuring their survival is through protection. For example, certain coral reefs and what have you. The others where sustainable management is a way of protecting. Any fisheries management that is properly implemented is in itself a form of protection. If you limit access to a certain area to fishing, if you limit the season, if you limit the species, if you limit the size, all those are measures of protection. Protection is very important, but if you protect, like the current narrative, 10% of the ocean for no take, it leaves the other 90% orphan. And it should be a combination of protection and sustainable management combined.
But when you hear Jens, for example, correct me if I got this wrong, but I think you said in your presentation that you think that the oceans can yield 6 times more food than they currently do.
Yeah. It's from a blue paper submitted to the high-level panel.
Yeah, you're right. And you regard it as credible. I mean, to me,
it's a blue paper, which is one of the scientific papers submitted to the panel.
Right. So I mean, that's an extraordinary sort of forecast and expansion of ocean food production. And you think, looking at you right now, Manuel, you think that can be done sustainably? Because we've had, our history with fish stocks and with marine exploitation isn't always a happy one.
Well, I don't recognize the figures of 6 times growth in production. These are not the figures that FAO uses.
Right.
In terms of marine fisheries, we currently catch about 18 million tons of fish. We think that the carrying capacity of the ocean is around 100 million tons. So that would be, that sort of growth it can be achieved.
That's...
If it is all managed sustainably at maximum capacity, so that is a certain growth, but it's not huge. Particularly if you remove illegal activity, which is doesn't appear in the statistics, you can get that sort of growth, but that's not 6 times. But aquaculture has a great potential. Aquaculture has been the fastest growing food production industry in the world for the last 50 years. The fastest growing, and it continues to. And there are places in the world where aquaculture is not developed at all. In Africa, the whole continent of Africa produces 2.5% of the global aquaculture production. One single country in the world produces 60% of the total aquaculture production globally. You can imagine what that country is?
China.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is capacity for growth, but there's capacity for sustainable growth, and it has to be done with care. FAO's figures are not 6 times growth at all, but we also say that it is absolutely essential that we consider oceans and aquatic systems in the future of food production, because land alone will not feed 10 billion people.
Indeed, I get that. Now, look, we don't have that much time left, and it's really important that we get insights and thoughts and questions from our audience, because there will be many people in here who make their lives in the oceans or who have connection to the oceans. I'm going to start with you, ma'am, if you stand up, and we'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, my name's Antonia Juhas. I'm a journalist from the United States. I write most often for Rolling Stone and Newsweek magazines, and my question is for Deputy Assistant Bloom. I'm curious as what you mean when you use the phrase the precautionary principle, that the Trump administration is pursuing the precautionary principle, and how that meshes with a very aggressive deregulatory agenda, including, in particular, in offshore drilling by the Trump administration, and how that meshes with fisheries. Because I'd like to challenge a little bit this idea of the deep compatibility between fisheries and offshore oil and gas drilling. I covered in depth, I even wrote a book on the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. I spent a lot of time with the fishery communities that were and continue to be devastated by that disaster. And the United States at the time had great experience with offshore drilling. BP, of course, had great experience with offshore drilling. It was in federal waters, very well regulated, yet the disaster still happened and the impacts still happened. A lot of the regulations that were put in place afterwards were pushed back by the Trump administration. So regulations that were put in place to try and stop it from happening again.
All right, well.
And just really quickly on Africa, again, let's look at Angola, where there was a great deal of very vibrant fisheries, which were decimated by offshore drilling there. And just more on this, to challenge this question of the fisheries and offshore drilling.
Well, it is a very interesting area to get into, but on that particular point, the Trump, you talked about the American dedication to the precautionary principle, and the question is wondering how that fits with the drive to ever more deregulation and to encourage more exploration that we see from the Trump administration.
Sure. Well, the sort of issues related to oil production are kind of out of my lane, but what I can say, and what I meant to refer to in terms of what we call a precautionary approach, is particularly when you're talking about fisheries, you have to have adequate science, and you don't want to run ahead and just start taking fish without knowledge of what the circumstances are. And that's why we were so happy that the 10 parties to the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement were able to come together and to work in what we felt was a precautionary way. Similarly, when it comes to regional fisheries management organizations, we want to take an ecosystem-based approach, because if there's overfishing, then the fish stocks decline, and in the end, you're not gaining the kind of food security benefits or environmental benefits that you're seeking. But in terms of oil issues, I'm afraid it's
you don't want to go
my
there.
area.
You don't want to go there. Okay, but I think the question still stands as a very interesting one. And the wider point was being made that actually in Angola as well, one can see that encouraging and expanding offshore fossil fuel exploration is actually, in specific cases, extremely damaging to fish stocks.
Well, I think that it's very important that I make this point. When I say that in my intervention that the assessed stocks are in general improving and getting better, that means that it's only the assessed stocks, and those are the majority of them in the developed world. In the developing world, the majority of stocks are not being assessed properly, and many of them are being overexploited. 1 in every 3 fish stocks worldwide is being overexploited. So we are seeing a divide that is extremely worrying from an FAO perspective, which is a developed world where the fishes are doing better and they're getting more fish from the developing world, where the fishes are not doing better, and nothing is being done about it because fisheries sustainability has been disvested. People are not funding programs on fish sustainability in the developing world.
Right.
It doesn't sell.
Okay, I do want to get a couple more questions in before we finish, and we've got to finish very soon. So, sorry, could we get the microphone to this gentleman here? Yeah, you don't look around because it really is you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Elko Leemans. I'm from the Clean Arctic Alliance. Sometimes improvement of the operation in the Arctic is really easy. And this particular case is a ban on heavy fuel oil by shipping. Now, this afternoon at 6 o'clock, we're organizing a fantastic event on the electric ship Brim Explorer on this topic, on the ban of heavy fuel oil, which is so easy because there's other fuel available. This year, this will be a crucial year for this case, with a couple of events at the IMO, International Maritime Organization. So I was wondering how the panel looks at the ban on heavy fuel oil.
Ending the use of heavy fuel oil in shipping, is it going to happen? Do you support it? I mean, it would be hard to argue with the case that it should happen.
So I thank you for raising that issue, and it's very much connected with your question about protection and whether the U.S. or other Arctic states are in favor of that, and I think that's a very good example. So and we've been working very closely with Norway as well, in favor of having a ban on use and carriage of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic. And my sense is that the prospects at the International Maritime Organization are pretty good for that, and I think that would be a tremendous step forward if we can get it through there.
Right. Jens, quickly.
Yeah, I think, but a lot of good work has been done in the IMO and in the EU about making the fuels better as well. So we have a good base to build on in that regard.
Right. Now, I know there's got a question here, so we're going to give you the last question because then we've got to just do a bit of panel shifting. So off you go.
Thank you. Chief Gary Harrison, traditional chief of Atnetana Dene in Alaska. And also one of the things that I also am involved in is the International Planning Committee at COFI at the FAO. And one of the things that was said up here is that fish stocks are doing well. Yet in Alaska, on many of the rivers, the king salmon fishing has been stopped because of the low production. And one of the peoples that are most affected are the subsistence people, and they only take less than 1% of the catch. So I'm wondering if this is so, I'm looking at two people here, Mr. Bloom and Emmanuel, and that's, are you planning on doing any more studies to figure out why these fish stocks are not developing as was said in the report? Because we know for a fact that this fishing is problematic for us because that's one of the stable fishes that we use for our subsistence.
Okay, well, let's have a quick answer on that then. Anybody want to take on what's happening in Alaska and what appears to be the decline in fish stocks?
Well, I'll just simply say, Chief, good morning to you. There's always cases of fisheries that are not doing well at any given time. Sustainability is difficult. You're all the time chasing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I would say that, for example, Bristol Bay that you mentioned yesterday is one of the gold standards in salmon fishery management around the world and producing fantastic fish over the last few years, records. But of course, there will be other places around that might not be doing so well. Over 90% of the fish stocks in the US are classified as above sustainability, but above in in the 10% that are not in that 90%, you will have cases of problems. And the issue is to identify those problems and to deal with them. But you are always going to be able to find problems. Otherwise, we'll be all out of a job.
Do you want to add anything, Evan? Or?
No, thank you, Chief Gary, for your question. I don't have anything to add about that particular fishery.
Well, I guess the message, as you've just said, is that one can look at the global trends and then one can find very specific examples, some of which run very much counter to global trends. But what I'm going to do now, ladies and gentlemen, is invite you to give a big thank you to our panel, because some of them are going to leave. So panel, thanks very much for this stage of our discussion. Now, Manuel and Evan and Vladimir, you stay. And Sam, we're going to say goodbye to you. And Jens, thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you very much.
Not at all. It's great to see you here, Sam. We always love to see you here. Let us invite a couple of new speakers. Well, actually, one is somebody we've met already. So we enjoyed the presentation from Hide Sakaguchi, representing JAMSTEC, the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology. So if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Sakaguchi, coming up onto the stage. And also give a warm welcome to Sissel Rogner, Director of the Institute of Marine Research here in Norway. So welcome to you both. Sissel, I'm sure you listened with great attention to the Minister of State here in Norway, outlining Norway's commitment, as he sees it, to a comprehensive ocean management strategy and sustainability at the heart of it. I asked whether, people were buying it as he laid it out. Are you buying it?
That's why I really enjoyed you pushed on integrated ecosystem management, because to us that's like a guitar riff and you were looking for poetry. I think that's actually the key element here, because if you look at the board behind us, we have to not look at fisheries at one time, one stock at one time, aquaculture. We have to add all the challenges on top to make a sustainable ocean. And that is the guitar riff of good ocean management. And for us, we see that in the Arctic, the oil industry is really challenging, because we have good stories in the North Sea, yes, but there is a different situation up north. And that's also why the scientists at the Institute for Marine Research, we claim that there are vulnerable areas that we think the consequences may be too large to start oil drilling up there. So that's why we give clear advice that you cannot do everything at one spot and still claim it to be sustainable, because we really want the ocean to be rich and clean into the eternity. That's what we think the Norwegian government want in the end, and the common generation.
Right, so you think these examples you've got of places in the far north where offshore exploration would not be wise. What are your specific reasons? What do you think the fundamental problem is?
Is that if you really want to have a blue economy, you have to discuss the risk and consequences if something fails. And that is also that there are areas where you put priorities on actually the blue biomasses that's really necessary for the coming generation to have healthy food. And I would really like to add on Manuel's talk, because we need healthy and clean food. After all, food is the most important for us. And we now see a growing population where malnutrition is the key. It's the key in industrialized countries as well in developing countries. And fish is the most excellent food source you can manage to have on your plate. And that is also why we say that if you really want to put a priority of the good things first, to have also a blue economy based on the biomass you can grow in the ocean. That's absolutely fantastic, and it can be done sustainably.
Well, that's very interesting, all of that, and there is a great deal of optimism about the potential for the expansion of food extraction from the oceans, and I get all of that. But Hide Sakaguchi, I want to come back to you, because a lot of this discussion is about the importance of investing in oceanographic science and technology and furthering what we as a species can do with our oceans. One thing that I've seen some reporting on and would love to know more about is the degree to which subsea underwater mineral extraction is an increasingly sort of exciting prospect for some people in industry who, of course, are desperate to find new sources of rare earth minerals and all sorts of other minerals. But again, it seems to me that runs the risk of undermining the notion of a long-term sustainable ocean management system, because it raises so many new challenges and problems. Are you looking at that?
Well, not only our research institute, but Japanese government is now trying to explore this deep sea mining issues.
You actively are,
yes,
are you?
Yes. But the point from this, the scientific research institute is everything must be recoverable. Because I've been working for Australia CSIRO exploration mining. That's exactly the topic I've been involved for a long time ago. But in the whole mining procedure, mining rehabilitation, that's the most important and that's the most costly point. That means after finishing mining, everything must be recovered as a initial state.
But even the process, never mind the post-mining recovery, but even the process, I mean, the pictures I've seen of these enormous underwater vehicles crushing rock, disturbing the seabed and causing enormous sort of damage, frankly, to the entire ecosystem. You're saying my government, the Australians and many others are pushing ahead with these new mining systems.
Yes, but still, nobody knows. And the point is we should not be manipulated with any sectors. And we have to be always fair for everyone. Because some people say deep sea mining, it's okay, because there is nothing at deep sea, and not in a really rich ecology at a very, deep point. But
when you say some people say, you mean the big mining corporations say?
Yes. But even within our research institute, biological people, they never ever say it's safe, but it's completely destroyed, and it's unrecoverable procedure. So there is still, big discussion, this big issue. But apparently, as we discussed in the previous panel discussion, oil and gas issue is nothing good for nature. That's the most important thing we have to admit. And sometimes, if we think about something from desire, people forget something very important. And that is very important. We have to be always be aware of that.
One of the dangers seems to me that the ocean doesn't have communities in it. I mean, it has a lot of marine life, but it doesn't have those with voices to speak up for it. I mean, I can see the attraction both for oil and gas explorers and for minerals corporations in putting their business increasingly onto the seabed, where there aren't whole sort of rafts of people saying, not in my backyard, because it is not their backyard. In fact, it's invisible from the surface. For all of the talk about responsible ocean management, it seems to me the danger is over the next decades, more and more economic activity will be put into the seas because, frankly, it's easier that way. Is this a concern that makes sense to you on the panel? Vladimir, you're sort of looking like you've got a thought on this.
You know, I think this was actually the motivation, and I was waiting for the prompt. For the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, it's easy to pronounce this actually. To propose to United Nations the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and every word matters here, for sustainable development, and we need science. So at least we need a decade to learn much more. You know, reflecting on discussion that we had just now, I would say that probably we know 10% of the composition of ocean ecosystems. And we would know probably 5%, and it's difficult to put it in quantitative terms, how they function. That is the level of knowledge. We know almost 18 or 19% of the ocean depths at the resolution that is required. When the Malaysian Boeing was being taught in the Indian Ocean, you know, they came to the area with an underwater vehicle that is able to reach the depths of 4 kilometers. And the depths in that particular area was 6 kilometers, so they didn't reach that place. So that is the level of knowledge. We know the surface of Mars better than we know the topography of the ocean. That's exactly why we need the new level of science that is focused on the issues that we are discussing, that is able to deliver.
And is there a good, now a good solid tradition of international cooperation in marine and oceanographic science?
You know, unfortunately, there is no logo here of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science. But, you know, it looks like a wave that is kind of spreading out the icons of sustainable development. But for me, actually, this logo looks like a snowball. There is a snowball emerging now and increasing. And, you know, people are coming together to work for the science, unite forces. And, you know, we speak about sustainable blue economy or ocean economy. That is the value every year of almost $3 trillion US. Ocean observations are just $1 billion US, so 3,000 times less. This is how we observe the ocean, to generate the value. And we are able to invest in management of the system roughly $300,000 US. Again, 3,000 times less. So we don't know what's happening in the ocean, and we don't even coordinate enough what we do. So that's the situation.
Sissel, I know you want to say something, then I'm going to get back to questions from our audience, but go on, you have your say.
Yeah, I would like to comment on how we use the bottom of the ocean as well, because after all, that's also ocean management, and I think there are certain areas where we shouldn't do mining, oil drilling. But also you have a picture up there that's mining on land where the debris is filled into the fjords. So there are all sorts of systems where we are using the seafloor for different activities. But also if we go back to what you say, that there are areas and where they are actually very vulnerable. And there are also, how should we then ask, what is the voice of the deep areas where we have little knowledge? For instance, behind me, there is a little creature that's pictured as Daphne. I had hoped that it should be a calanus, because that's actually one of the key elements in driving the ecosystem along the coast. In the deep, deep water, they survive during the winter. And we do not know the magic of these ecosystem drivers. So we really have to be careful about irreversible processes, because what we see, it takes so long time to restore damaged areas. So then again, we have to do planning for which area, for which activity to make it sustainable.
Well, I guess the message I'm getting is that our scientific knowledge of what is really happening across our vast oceans is still, I mean, frankly, it's less perhaps than one might imagine, the depth of our knowledge. Let's get back to questions. I'd love to get some more questions from all of you guys. If there are people who've got insights, involvement in the ocean, thoughts on what we've heard this morning, I'd love to get to you. So you, sir, thank you. We'll get you the microphone.
Thank you. My name is David Balton from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. In addition to the UN decade, the United Nations has another exercise underway about the ocean. It's a treaty being negotiated on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. To any of the panelists that wish to comment, what are your hopes and dreams for how this agreement could affect management in the Arctic regions beyond national jurisdiction?
Right. Evan, is that something you're involved with?
Sure. Well, Dave, thanks. As you know, there's this large-scale UN negotiation on conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is quite a mouthful, but that's kind of how things sound at the UN. The focus on that is in part how one would establish marine protected areas and areas beyond national jurisdiction, in other words, the high seas. And we're headed into what could be a final set of meetings in March, April this year. Discussions have been going on for more than a decade, and there are a huge number of issues that have yet to be resolved. The most prominent issues that people tend to focus on are related to marine protected areas, but it also focuses on the regulation of marine genetic resources and what's called sharing of benefits related to marine genetic resources. That's a pretty controversial area because it has to do with potential royalties for inventions and whether access to by scientists should be limited in the high seas in order to ensure that there's a tracing back so that royalties can be paid.
You mean a sort of intellectual property?
Yes, exactly
argument.
right.
Yeah.
So all of that, when you add the 190 countries at the UN, is a kind of a hard slog to get through, but it is kind of coming to a head at this point. For our part, we see some benefits in providing for coordination among regional and sectoral bodies like the regional Fisheries Management Organization, the IMO, the International Seabed Authority, and also increasing the capacity of developing countries with respect to ocean science. But there are a lot of hard issues to deal with.
I mean, I don't mean to be sounding too cynical or skeptical, but we live in an age, and we've referred to it several times in Arctic Frontiers 2020, an age of increasingly assertive nationalism from the big powers. And, you know, I'm not trying to make a hugely political point about Donald Trump here, but the way the United States operates at the moment is, you know, frankly, less interested in rules-based multilateral institutions and agreements and much more sort of openly assertive about its national interest. And one could say the same about China, one could say the same about Russia, the big powers, all of whom will be big players in the future of the Arctic. So when you're talking about UN initiatives and all of this global cooperation, are we really to believe that the next decade is going to be a decade of much greater cooperation and multilateralism? Because it, frankly, viewing from right here, it looks unlikely.
I would like to reflect on that, if I may, because, you know, and it is the power of science. You know, we know not enough, but we know more, and the certainty in our projections is increasing. Actually, when we speak about climate change, we know that the error, that potential error that comes from models, is much less than the error that comes from our assumptions, what is going to happen with the emissions. So we know how to predict. Now we need to communicate the message, and I think this is at least I can predict the increase in the international cooperation in science and climate and the ocean, in protection of the ocean, management of the ocean. I think we need just to
it just strikes me there might be more cooperation on a scientific level, but whether it translates.
And it is your job now.
My job?
Yes.
Oh my God.
It's your job to really help us to achieve our goals.
You mean to put more pressure on the international politicians? Well, maybe, but God help us all if you're relying on me. But did you, Manuel, did you?
Well, just to reflect on, and you're absolutely right, science, I'm also a scientist, I'm still an active scientist, and science has a very good cooperation across the world. In marine science is one of the most cohesive groups of scientists of any discipline I've come across. So there's very little doubt on that. But, you know, the world is a complex place, and there are thousands and millions of people out there that believe in the multilateral system, that continue to work on the multilateral system and strengthen it no matter what. And one of the perhaps unintended consequences of the BBNJ process, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction process, has been the strengthening of the regional fisheries management organizations. There are 25 of those around the world. Some of them manage some of the biggest resources, the tuna resources. They are completely out of the radar of most people, but that have been operating in the multilateral system. You know, it's not the whole world in each one of them. It's a group of nations that care on a particular region or a particular resource. And this process has realized how important those RFMOs are, that we have created them over time. We have been strengthening them. They did not work very well in the beginning, but now more and more they are working very well. And putting the focus on the high seas has highlighted the fact that we have a lot out there that we need to strengthen in order to make science count. The power of knowledge, you know, if you use the knowledge well, we can find solutions. If we don't use the knowledge well, we don't find solutions. And without the institutions, there's no way of using the knowledge.
Right. But it is that interface between those developing the knowledge and those wielding power that really matters. And
welcome to my world.
All right, we've got a little bit of time left. Oh, we've got a question there, so I'm going to come to you, sir. Yeah, the mic's right there.
Thank you. Hans Corell, former legal counsel of the United Nations. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that there are several references to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of these goals is necessary to achieve all the others. Goal 16, on equal justice for all, with the targets rule of law and anti-corruption. And here, power of knowledge. I was advised by Helmut Schmidt of Germany that politicians know too little about the rule of law. But it's now available because of this by two institutions on the web, a guide for politicians on the rule of law. I suggest you take down 7 words. Rule of law, a guide for politicians. It's only some 40 pages for non-lawyers. And it is available in 25 languages, with 2 more to come in a few days. And it doesn't cost anything. That was the whole idea. That was my comment. My question is that there were references to the IMO, low sulfur fuel mandates. And I just read an article yesterday that a new study finds IMO low sulfur fuel mandate actually boosts dangerous black carbon emissions in the Arctic. I don't know if you have heard about this, and do you have a comment on this? Is the IMO, that was actually praised a while ago in the panel here, have they made a mistake here? Thank you.
Is that in anybody's field of expertise? It's not in mine, but can anybody comment on that?
Yes, it is right. And also, scientists have already found quite large amount of black carbon at Arctic region, and which may change the radiation effect and also energy intaking effect. And so it is a very important issue to explore and find out the amount of carbon particles and also some additional effect. This is very serious issues, yes.
We're short of time, but we've got time for one more if there is one. You win the lottery, ma'am. I think you're going to get the last question, so the microphone is coming.
Thank you. I'm Karolina from Worldwide Fund for Nature here in Norway. There's a lot of talk about regulation and good intention, and we know that a lot of the activity that happens at sea is not monitored, and a lot of illegal activity, particularly in fisheries. How about enforcement and sanctions? How do we get that into place, particularly in the high seas, but also in national waters where we see that there is a lot of illegal activities?
I think that is a very important question, and since Arctic Frontiers is where politicians and policymakers and scientists meet, and I think to be able to do something about the illegal and unregulated fisheries, that's something that could be done today if there is political will, because we have technology to do that. There are also legal opportunities, for instance, to regulate those boats entering into ports. So for me, I think this is actually a go home and do your homework issue.
Do better.
Must do better, yes. And it can be done with beautiful technology. And then we get better food, less criminal activity at sea. We all would benefit from it, and we will get better management of the stocks.
Well, it's the familiar story then. The technology is there, the science has delivered the technology for us, but then it's a question of the political will.
Yeah, and isn't it a beautiful story to end here today?
Are you telling me we've got to wrap the panel now?
Yes.
You clearly need a cup of coffee. Well, I think I do too. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, with complete agreement between moderator and panel, we will declare that this session on the oceans is done, but I hope it's going to generate more discussion in the corridors and in the future with many of you involved in ocean issues. So do keep the conversation going. We will break for half an hour of coffee and refreshment, and I'll see you back here after that. But do thank our panel very much indeed. Thank you, panel. Thank you.